Welcome back to the channel, and I hope you enjoy this monologue that I'm making whilst still at home. And as I promised you, we will be sharing quite a lot more things until, of course, I hit the road. And today I wanted to share with you something else, something which is of interest to me, but I hope as well that it will be to you. That is, of course, related to reading. You know, reading is a whole art. It is an art, and then understanding what you read is more important as well than just knowing what you read. It's as important as knowing what you read. But you realize that a lot of people make mistakes when it comes to reading, and I want to share with you my thoughts on why I think they make mistakes and how should they avoid these mistakes. Because in most cases, you can be writing something and then somebody else, it gets lost into translation, and somebody else interpret it completely um, uh, differently than what you intended. So there are a few things that you've got to know, if you would like to read and understand the book. But before we go there, from a writer's perspective, when a subject or when a gnosis, when a knowledge is imparted into you or onto you from, a higher realm of unconsciousness into your subconsciousness, you want to share it with an audience, with, people that you think might be interested in what you have learned. So now this message or this knowledge is imparted onto your subconsciousness. Now you take it from there and it is digested into your mind, digested into your mind. And then from there on, you want to put it into writing to convey, basically, here the writing is just a way, a channel to convey the message that you have received. So what you do is you take this knowledge that you have into your consciousness and then you encode it into writings, and bear in mind already, you can never really accurately describe what is in your mind as much as you are good with the language. Words are never really you will never really get the appropriate word to express what you feel, or what you know. But at least you try to the best of your ability to encode this message or this feeling or this knowledge into a readable message, that you want to share with somebody else. Then what happened is, after you encode this message into writing, which in itself is also a form of, in itself it's how do I say this? I'm going to use the telephone analogy where, the message, the voice goes from one side and then it's turned into signals and then goes through the wires and then it has to reach the other side and then decode it into a voice. So basically that's what you do with your writing. You encode it and then it goes through the medium of text, message or language to reach your audience. Now that's where the problem comes. The message reaches your audience or the people that you are aiming to reach, and then they receive it, decode it, upload it in their mind, and try to digest what you imply or what you mean into their consciousness. Now the problem arises where you have 1,000 people reading the same text, but each and everybody understands it his own way. That's where the infamous word comes, lost into translation. So your message is kind of like perceived, and the readers are actually understanding it from their perspective. They read you from their perspective, and that's where the mistake is. As a reader, that's what you make as a mistake. When you read a book, you must at all times try to read and understand the message from the writer's perspective. This is why today, for instance, you have if with religion, you have several religions, and it's the same book that is read, but several denominations of maybe like Christianity, but the same book that is read, interpreted differently, because each and everybody reads and understands it his own way, and then he thinks his way is the best. But we forget, and most of us are not even aware of who wrote these words, what were the intent. That's where you should begin. See, before you read a book, you have got to know the author. And I'm not saying knowing them on obviously physical standpoint or so, but you have to know him as in understanding where they came from. It's quite easier. It's a bit more easier to understand where somebody comes from with his thought, than it is to just imply that this is what they mean, which is not always the case. So if you understand where the writer comes from, and then you get closer to who he is or who he was as a person, you shift your perspective from reading from your perspective to understand it from their perspective. And that makes more sense. Now, I'll give you an example. I've got a friend of mine who's from South Africa. He's a writer. His name is Teboho Brown Teboho. Hello, Brown Teboho. I'm sure you'll be watching this. So, I know him. Well, you can never really assume to know somebody, but, I know Teboho Brown. I've spent time with him, so I know where it comes from in terms of intentions. So when he writes, he's been writing a lot of columns for newspapers and also essays for so many things, but he writes a lot. So when you read Brown Teboho from your perspective, you can feel offended. You can feel very offended, or you can feel him to be more direct, dry, and just mean. He's a bit mean. He is mean, yes, but yeah, a good mean, So, but you will see him as he's very mean. Anyway, you will see him as it will come across as mean, but he means well in his meanness. And I know him, so when if I read Brown from my perspective, I usually tell him to put a little bit of water into his wine, because it's a little bit too strong. But when I read it from his perspective, I understand what he means, and I know what he means, because I am in his shoes and I'm in his mind, so I'm able to communicate, to connect with his writings from his standpoint. And I think if we can exercise that as readers, there will be less room for misinterpretation. And it's very good, after knowing where your author comes from in terms of intention, you also have to know in which state of mind he was or he is when he writes his book, or when he was writing the book that you read. Because you see, let's say for instance your author was a little bit drunk when he wrote that, so there is he was a drunkard. Let's say he was a drunkard. You can tell from his writing, and if you know that he was a drunkard, you can tell from his writing that there will be something emphasizing it, and then you can read from that standpoint to maybe try and make sense of what he's saying. Or maybe he was like, I give you an example with me. Sometimes I write, but it stems from a state of trance. I could be in a trance. I find myself in a trance, and then I just grab a pen, and then I just write. I don't know what I'm writing, but I'm just writing. I write until it fades away. And I don't even remember a single word of what I was writing. But when I read later on, it's new to me, but it's also something that I do really understand and makes a bit more sense. But yeah, again, so if your author is you know was writing it from a state of trance, or is very much known to be in that kind of state when he writes, well, I'm not saying you should be in trance when you read it, but just bear it in mind that what he was downloading from the unconscious, I mean the greater consciousness into his consciousness, was things fed to him, and then he was just making sure that he released them in terms of writing. So you just bear that in mind. And then you also have, for instance, cases where your author might have written the book um, from a prison cell. From, yeah, well, he was at a stage in his life where he maybe battled with depression, and then he wrote the book then. But you have to get to know him and understand, and then read it from that perspective. Then it will make sense to you, and then a lot more people will be in agreement with what he writes, if they were to see it from his perspective. I think reading is an interesting thing. It is an interesting hobby, or interesting task, or I don't know what to call it, but it is something that's interesting and worth pursuing. I mean, worth paying attention to in the pursuit of knowledge. But it's very, very important to be delicate about understanding that it's a message that is conveyed, and you also have to ask yourself, what is the intention of the author in trying to sway you or convince you to see things the way he does? Because there is also a motive behind writing. Is it from a selfless standpoint? Is it from a mea culpa standpoint, or which standpoint is he writing from? If you read the book by Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, it's clear. You read it from if you read it from his perspective, you see somebody who's trying to make an apology for the things that he stands for, and then he is trying to convince you that he's some sort of a, not a saint, but a benevolent